Welcome to Sinister Memory. If you're new here, subscribe now and let us know in the comments where you're listening to this story. Let's get to today's story. The winter of 1907 brought with it an unusual silence to the remote township of Pine Ridge, Minnesota. Dr. Marcus Aldrich had grown accustomed to the peculiar cases that found their way to his modest practice, nestled between the dense woodlands and the frozen expanse of Lake Superior. Yet nothing in his 23 years of medical experience had prepared him for the patient who would arrive on that bitter February morning, forever altering his understanding of human physiology and the boundaries between life and death. The circumstances surrounding Edward Harris's arrival at the Pine Ridge Medical Facility were documented with meticulous detail in Dr. Aldrich's personal journal, a leather-bound volume that would later become the primary source for understanding the extraordinary events that followed. According to the physician's careful handwriting, Harris was discovered by a logging crew approximately 12 miles northeast of the township, lying motionless beneath a collapsed section of timber near the old Mackenzie Mill. The loggers, led by foreman Thomas Brennan, initially assumed they had uncovered a corpse. Harris exhibited no visible signs of life. His skin had taken on a pallid, almost translucent quality, and his body temperature appeared to match that of the surrounding snow. Most disturbing of all, none of the men could detect a pulse or any indication of breathing. Yet something about the man's appearance troubled Brennan sufficiently to warrant immediate transport to Dr. Aldrich's facility rather than to the town mortuary. Upon examination, Dr. Aldrich's findings defied conventional medical understanding. Harris appeared to be a man of approximately 35 years, well-nourished despite his current condition, with no obvious signs of injury or disease. His clothing suggested he was not a local resident. The fine wool coat and leather boots were of a quality rarely seen in the rural communities surrounding Pine Ridge. More puzzling still was the complete absence of identification or personal effects, save for a peculiar brass pocket watch that had stopped at precisely 3:17. The initial medical assessment, as recorded in the facility's official records, documented a series of impossible observations. Harris's body temperature registered at 62 degrees Fahrenheit, far below the threshold compatible with human survival. No pulse could be detected at any of the conventional points, nor could Dr. Aldrich discern any respiratory activity using his most sensitive instruments. The patient's pupils remained fixed and dilated, showing no response to light stimulation. By every measurable standard, Edward Harris was deceased, yet the man's flesh retained a suppleness that contradicted the expected rigor mortis. His skin, while unnaturally pale, showed no signs of the discoloration or decomposition that should have been evident. Most unsettling of all was the patient's eyes. Though unresponsive to external stimuli, they seemed to track movement with an awareness that suggested consciousness persisted despite the absence of vital signs. Dr. Aldrich's decision to treat Harris as a living patient rather than a corpse was met with considerable skepticism from his assistant, Nurse Margaret Finley, and the facility's groundskeeper, old Henrik Larson. The physician's journal entries from this period reveal his own internal struggle between scientific rationality and the inexplicable evidence before him. He wrote extensively about the ethical implications of his choice, questioning whether he was providing medical care or merely delaying the inevitable acceptance of death. The patient was placed in the facility's isolation ward, a small room typically reserved for cases of infectious disease. Dr. Aldrich established a routine of hourly observations, documenting every detail of Harris's condition with the thoroughness of a man who understood he might be witnessing something unprecedented in medical history. The temperature of the room was maintained at a constant 72 degrees. Yet Harris's body temperature remained stubbornly fixed at its impossible low reading. As the first week progressed, subtle changes began to manifest. The patient's skin gradually took on a faint luminescence, barely perceptible in daylight but clearly visible in the dim illumination of the oil lamps used during evening observations. This phenomenon was accompanied by an almost imperceptible humming sound that seemed to emanate from Harris's chest cavity, despite the continued absence of heartbeat or breathing. The local community's awareness of the unusual patient grew slowly, carried by whispered conversations between the facility's staff and their families. Pine Ridge had always been a place where strange occurrences were met with a mixture of curiosity and superstition. But the case of Edward Harris challenged even the most open-minded residents. Some suggested the man was merely in a state of suspended animation brought on by extreme cold, while others whispered of more supernatural explanations. Dr. Aldrich's final entry for the chapter period noted his growing conviction that Harris represented something entirely outside the realm of conventional medicine, a living contradiction that would require new frameworks of understanding to comprehend fully. The second week of Edward Harris's residence at the Pine Ridge Medical Facility brought with it a series of observations that would challenge Dr. Aldrich's scientific methodology and force him to question the very foundations of his medical training. The physician's journal entries from this period reveal a man grappling with phenomena that existed beyond the boundaries of established medical knowledge, yet determined to document every detail with the precision of a true scientist. Harris's condition remained fundamentally unchanged. No pulse, no respiration, no response to external stimuli. Yet the subtle manifestations that had begun during the first week continued to evolve in ways that defied rational explanation. The luminescence emanating from his skin had intensified slightly, creating an ethereal glow that was particularly pronounced during the darkest hours of the night. Dr. Aldrich noted that this radiance seemed to pulse in a rhythm that bore no correlation to any known biological function, occurring approximately every 47 seconds with mechanical regularity. The humming sound originating from Harris's chest cavity had also grown more distinct, though it remained at the very threshold of human hearing. Dr. Aldrich attempted to measure this phenomenon using a primitive stethoscope of his own design, but the sound seemed to exist in a frequency range that conventional instruments could not adequately capture. The physician's frustration with the limitations of his equipment led him to rely increasingly on his own sensory observations, a methodology that troubled his scientifically trained mind. Nurse Finley's reports during this period documented her growing unease with the patient's presence in the facility. She noted that the temperature in Harris's room seemed to fluctuate independently of the heating system, dropping several degrees during certain hours of the night, despite the consistent operation of the wood-burning stove. More disturbing still were her observations of the patient's eyes, which she claimed would occasionally shift position when no one was directly observing him, though they remained fixed and unresponsive during formal examinations. The facility's isolation ward had never been intended for long-term occupancy, and the extended presence of Harris began to affect the building itself in subtle but measurable ways. Dr. Aldrich documented the appearance of frost patterns on the windows that formed intricate, almost geometric designs, unlike any natural ice formations he had previously observed. These patterns would appear overnight and disappear with the morning sun, leaving no trace of moisture on the glass surfaces. Henrik Larsson, the facility's groundskeeper, reported increasingly unusual behavior among the local wildlife during this period. Birds that typically migrated south for the winter had begun gathering in the trees surrounding the medical facility, their songs creating harmonies that seemed to echo the frequency of Harris's mysterious humming. Small animals, rabbits, squirrels, even the occasional deer would approach the building and remain motionless for hours, as if drawn by some invisible force emanating from within. Dr. Aldrich's attempts to understand Harris's condition led him to correspond with colleagues at medical institutions in Minneapolis and Chicago. His carefully worded letters described a patient exhibiting unusual physiological responses to severe hypothermia, without revealing the full extent of the anomalies he was witnessing. The responses he received offered conventional explanations for suspended animation and hypothermic preservation, but none addressed the specific combination of symptoms Harris displayed. The physician's growing isolation from the medical establishment was compounded by the reactions of Pine Ridge's residents to the ongoing situation. Word of the strange patient had spread throughout the small community, creating an atmosphere of nervous anticipation that affected daily life in subtle but pervasive ways. Local merchants reported unusual dreams filled with images of frozen landscapes and distant humming sounds. Children complained of nightmares featuring a pale man who watched them from the shadows without blinking. During the 10th night of Harris's stay, Dr. Aldrich experienced what he described in his journal as the most profound disturbance of my professional career. While conducting his routine midnight observation, the physician noticed that Harris's position had shifted slightly from the precise arrangement in which he had been placed earlier that evening. The change was minimal, a slight turn of the head, a barely perceptible adjustment of the hands, but it represented the first clear evidence of voluntary movement since the patient's arrival. More unsettling than the movement itself was Dr. Aldrich's realization that he had no memory of the transition occurring. Despite maintaining constant vigilance throughout the evening, the physician could not recall the exact moment when Harris had changed position. This gap in his awareness troubled him deeply, suggesting that the patient's influence extended beyond the physical realm into areas of perception and consciousness that medical science had yet to explore. The chapter concluded with Dr. Aldrich's decision to implement continuous observation protocols, enlisting the assistance of Nurse Finley and Henrik Larsson to maintain an unbroken watch over Harris. The physician's final entry for this period expressed his growing conviction that they were dealing with something that transcended conventional understanding of life and death. The implementation of continuous observation protocols at the Pine Ridge Medical Facility marked the beginning of what Dr. Aldrich would later describe as the most psychologically demanding period of his medical career. The three-person rotation established between himself, Nurse Finley, and Henrik Larsson created an unbroken chain of surveillance over Edward Harris. Yet the results of this intensified scrutiny only deepened the mystery surrounding the patient's impossible condition. Dr. Aldrich's detailed logs from this period reveal a systematic approach to documentation that bordered on obsessive. Every 15 minutes, the assigned observer would record Harris's position, the intensity of his luminescence, the frequency of the humming emanation, and the ambient temperature of the room. These measurements were cross-referenced with external factors such as weather conditions, lunar phases, and the time of day, as the physician desperately sought patterns that might explain the phenomena they were witnessing. The results of this meticulous observation yielded disturbing insights into Harris's nature. The patient's movements, while subtle, occurred with a regularity that suggested conscious intention rather than involuntary muscular contractions. These adjustments typically happened during the transition periods between observers, despite the careful coordination designed to eliminate gaps in surveillance. Most troubling was the discovery that each observer experienced brief lapses in attention during their shifts, moments of inexplicable distraction that coincided precisely with Harris's positional changes. Nurse Finley's reports during her night shifts documented the most significant anomalies. She noted that Harris's luminescence reached its peak intensity between the hours of 2 and 4 in the morning, creating enough light to read by without the assistance of oil lamps. During these periods, The geometric frost patterns on the windows became more elaborate, forming designs that resembled mathematical equations or perhaps some form of unknown script. The nurse's attempts to sketch these formations proved frustrating, as the patterns seemed to shift and change whenever she looked away from her drawing. Henrik Larsson's observations focused primarily on the external manifestations of Harris's presence. The groundskeeper documented the continued gathering of wildlife around the facility, noting that the animals had begun to arrange themselves in specific formations that mirrored the frost patterns appearing on the windows. More disturbing was his discovery of circular areas in the snow surrounding the building, where the ice had melted despite temperatures that remained well below freezing. These zones appeared overnight and maintained their liquid state throughout the day, defying all natural laws of thermodynamics. The psychological toll of the constant vigil began to manifest in all three observers by the end of the second week. Dr. Aldrich noted increasing difficulty in maintaining focus during his shifts, describing a peculiar sensation of his thoughts being gently redirected whenever he attempted to concentrate too intently on Harris's condition. Nurse Finley reported recurring dreams in which she found herself standing in vast, frozen landscapes while a distant voice called to her in a language she could not understand. Henrik Larsson became increasingly withdrawn, spending his off-duty hours carving intricate wooden figures that bore an unsettling resemblance to the frost patterns appearing on the facility's windows. The most significant development during this period was the discovery of Harris's apparent awareness of his observers. Dr. Aldrich first noticed this phenomenon during a particularly intense observation session, when he realized that Harris's eyes, while maintaining their fixed and dilated appearance, seemed to track his movements around the room. This awareness was subtle but unmistakable, a slight shift in the angle of the pupils that followed the physician's path with mechanical precision. Further experimentation revealed that Harris responded to the presence of each observer differently. With Dr. Aldrich, the patient's luminescence would dim slightly, as if in deference to the physician's authority. Nurse Finley's presence seemed to intensify the humming emanation from Harris's chest, creating harmonics that resonated through the building's wooden structure. Henrik Larsson's shifts were marked by the most dramatic external manifestations. The wildlife gatherings would reach their peak during his watch, and the mysterious melted zones in the snow would expand significantly. The facility's isolation from the outside world became increasingly pronounced as word of the strange occurrences spread throughout the region. Dr. Aldrich's correspondence with medical colleagues had ceased entirely, as his attempts to describe Harris's condition were met with skepticism that bordered on concern for the physician's mental state. Local residents began avoiding the area around the medical facility, creating an unofficial quarantine that left the three observers completely alone with their impossible patient. By the conclusion of the third week, Dr. Aldrich had reached a troubling realization that he documented in his private journal with characteristic precision. Harris was not merely a patient exhibiting unusual symptoms, he was something fundamentally different from human life, as medical science understood it. The physician's final entry for this period expressed his growing conviction that they were not observing a man who had survived without a heartbeat, but rather something that had never possessed a heartbeat to begin with. The fourth week of Edward Harris's presence at the Pine Ridge Medical Facility brought with it a fundamental shift in the nature of the observations being conducted. What had begun as a medical investigation had evolved into something approaching a vigil of an entirely different character. Dr. Aldrich's journal entries from this period reveal a man who had abandoned conventional scientific methodology in favor of a more intuitive approach to understanding the phenomenon before him. The continuous observation protocols had yielded an unexpected consequence. The three watchers found themselves developing an almost telepathic awareness of Harris's condition and each other's mental states. Dr. Aldrich first noticed this phenomenon when he realized he could sense the exact moment when Nurse Finley's attention would waver during her shifts, even when he was in a completely different part of the building. Similarly, Henrik Larsson began anticipating the physician's needs during examinations, preparing instruments and adjusting lighting without being asked. This heightened sensitivity extended to their perception of Harris himself. The patient's luminescence had become more responsive to the emotional states of his observers, brightening when they experienced moments of clarity or understanding, and dimming when confusion or fear dominated their thoughts. The humming emanation from his chest had evolved into a complex harmonic pattern that seemed to resonate with the heartbeats of those in his presence, creating an eerie synchronization that left all three observers feeling as though they were participants in some ancient ritual rather than medical professionals conducting clinical observations. Dr. Aldrich's attempts to maintain scientific objectivity were increasingly undermined by experiences that defied rational explanation. During one particularly intense observation session, the physician found himself able to perceive Harris's thoughts, not as words or images, but as pure concepts that bypassed normal sensory channels entirely. These mental impressions conveyed a sense of vast loneliness and an overwhelming desire for connection that transcended human understanding. The experience left Dr. Aldrich profoundly shaken, yet also filled with an inexplicable sense of purpose. Nurse Finley's reports during this period documented her growing ability to predict Harris's subtle movements and changes in luminescence. She described feeling as though she was learning to read an entirely new form of communication, one that operated through variations in light intensity and harmonic frequencies rather than conventional language. Her sketches of the frost patterns had become increasingly accurate, as if her understanding of their meaning was developing through prolonged exposure rather than conscious study. The external manifestations of Harris's presence had intensified dramatically. Henrik Larsson reported that the wildlife gatherings around the facility had grown to include species that should not have been present in the Minnesota winter: tropical birds, insects that belong to warmer climates, and small mammals whose natural habitats lay hundreds of miles to the south. These creatures showed no signs of distress despite the harsh conditions, as if Harris's influence created a micro-environment that sustained life in ways that conventional biology could not explain. The melted zones in the snow had expanded to form intricate patterns that mirrored the frost formations on the windows, creating a complex mandala of liquid water that remained unfrozen despite temperatures that had dropped to nearly 30 degrees below zero. Local residents who ventured close enough to observe these formations reported experiencing vivid hallucinations and a compulsive desire to approach the medical facility, though none had yet acted on these impulses. Dr. Aldrich's correspondence with the outside world had ceased entirely, not through choice, but through a growing inability to articulate his experiences in terms that others might understand. His attempts to write letters to colleagues resulted in pages of incomprehensible symbols that resembled the frost patterns rather than conventional text. This linguistic deterioration troubled the physician deeply, yet he found himself accepting it as a natural consequence of his prolonged exposure to Harris's influence. The most significant development during this period was the emergence of what Dr. Aldrich termed communion episodes, moments when all three observers would simultaneously experience a profound connection to Harris's consciousness. These events typically occurred during the deepest hours of the night and were characterized by a complete cessation of the patient's luminescence and humming, followed by an overwhelming sense of shared awareness that left all participants feeling as though they had glimpsed something vast and incomprehensible. During these communion episodes, the observers gained fragmentary insights into Harris's nature and origins. The impressions they received suggested that he was not a human being who had survived an impossible medical condition, but rather something that had taken human form for purposes that remained unclear. The sense of ancient loneliness that permeated these experiences implied that Harris had existed in this state for far longer than the few weeks since his discovery at the Mackenzie Mill. By the end of the 4th week, Dr. Aldrich had reached a conclusion that he documented with characteristic precision, despite its profound implications. Harris was not a patient requiring medical treatment, but rather a being whose very existence challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of life, consciousness, and reality itself. The 5th week of Edward Harris's residence at the Pine Ridge Medical Facility marked a turning point that would forever alter the understanding of the 3 observers who had dedicated themselves to his study. Dr. Aldrich's journal entries from this period reveal a man who had moved beyond scientific inquiry into a realm of experience that bordered on the mystical. Yet his commitment to documentation remained unwavering despite the increasingly extraordinary nature of his observations. The communion episodes had become more frequent and intense, occurring not only during the night hours but also during periods of daylight, when the facility was bathed in the pale winter sun. These experiences had evolved from brief moments of shared consciousness into extended periods of mental connection that could last for hours. During these episodes, the 3 observers found themselves accessing memories and knowledge that clearly did not belong to their own experiences, yet felt as familiar as their own thoughts. Through these shared visions, a clearer picture of Harris's true nature began to emerge. The impressions conveyed during communion suggested that he was not an individual entity, but rather a manifestation of something far more complex, a consciousness that existed across multiple dimensions of reality, using the human form as a temporary vessel for interaction with the physical world. The loneliness that permeated his presence was not the isolation of a single being, but the profound separation experienced by a collective consciousness that had become disconnected from its source. Dr. Aldrich's medical training proved inadequate for processing these revelations, yet his scientific methodology adapted to accommodate concepts that existed beyond conventional understanding. He began documenting the communion episodes with the same precision he had once applied to measuring pulse rates and body temperatures, creating detailed maps of the shared experiences that revealed patterns and consistencies that suggested an underlying logic to Harris's existence. The external manifestations of Harris's presence had reached a crescendo that could no longer be ignored by the surrounding community. The wildlife gatherings had grown to include creatures that defied biological classification, beings that appeared to be hybrids of known species, or perhaps entirely new forms of life that had emerged in response to Harris's influence. These entities showed no aggression toward humans, but maintained a constant vigil around the facility, as if waiting for some predetermined signal. The melted zones in the snow had expanded to encompass the entire area surrounding the medical facility, creating a circular oasis of liquid water that remained at a constant temperature regardless of external weather conditions. Within this zone, plant life had begun to emerge despite the winter season. Flowers and grasses that bore no resemblance to local flora, their colors shifting and changing in patterns that mirrored Harris's luminescence. Nurse Finley's transformation during this period was perhaps the most dramatic of the 3 observers. Her ability to interpret Harris's non-verbal communications had developed to the point where she could anticipate his needs and responses with uncanny accuracy. More significantly, she had begun to exhibit some of Harris's characteristics herself, a faint luminescence that was visible in complete darkness, and an ability to remain motionless for extended periods without experiencing fatigue or discomfort. Henrik Larsson's connection to Harris manifested through his woodworking, which had evolved from simple carvings into complex three-dimensional sculptures that seemed to capture the essence of the communion experiences in physical form. These creations defied conventional artistic interpretation, appearing to shift and change when viewed from different angles, as if they existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The most profound revelation came during a particularly intense communion episode that lasted for nearly 6 hours. During this experience, the three observers gained access to Harris's memories of his arrival in their reality. The visions revealed that he had not been discovered at the Mackenzie Mill by chance, but had deliberately manifested in that location as part of a larger purpose that remained unclear. The collapsed timber that had supposedly trapped him was revealed to be a carefully constructed facade designed to provide a plausible explanation for his presence. More disturbing was the realization that Harris's manifestation in Pine Ridge was not an isolated event. The communion revealed glimpses of similar occurrences in other remote locations throughout history, beings like Harris appearing in small communities, studied by dedicated observers who gradually became part of something larger than themselves. These historical precedents suggested a pattern of contact that spanned centuries, each instance building toward some ultimate convergence that remained beyond human comprehension. By the conclusion of the 5th week, Dr. Aldrich had documented his final medical observation of Edward Harris. The physician's journal entry for this period marked the end of his attempt to understand Harris through conventional means and the beginning of his acceptance of a role that transcended his medical training. The 6th week brought with it changes that transcended the boundaries of observation and entered the realm of participation. Dr. Aldrich's journal entries from this period reveal a fundamental shift in perspective. The three watchers were no longer studying Edward Harris, but had become integral components of whatever process his presence had initiated. The physician's handwriting during these final documented days showed subtle alterations in style and formation, as if the very act of recording had been influenced by forces beyond his conscious control. Harris's physical form had begun to exhibit new characteristics that defied the static nature of his previous condition. While he remained without pulse or respiration, his body had started to emit a barely audible resonance that seemed to harmonize with the natural frequencies of the Earth itself. Dr. Aldrich's sensitive instruments detected vibrations that matched the seismic rhythms deep beneath the Minnesota soil, suggesting that Harris had somehow synchronized with geological processes that operated on timescales far beyond human comprehension. The luminescence emanating from Harris's form had evolved into complex patterns that resembled star charts or mathematical equations rendered in living light. These formations would appear and dissolve across his skin in cycles that corresponded to celestial movements, creating a living map of astronomical phenomena that extended far beyond the visible night sky. Nurse Finley's attempts to document these patterns resulted in drawings that seemed to predict astronomical events with impossible accuracy. The three observers had undergone their own transformations during this period. Dr. Aldrich found that his need for sleep had diminished significantly, replaced by periods of meditative stillness during which he remained fully conscious, yet experienced a profound sense of rest. His perception of time had altered as well. Minutes could feel like hours, while entire days seemed to pass in moments, as if his consciousness had become unmoored from conventional temporal flow. Nurse Finley's metamorphosis was more visually apparent. Her movements had acquired a fluid quality that seemed to defy normal human biomechanics, and her eyes had developed a reflective quality that captured and held light in ways that suggested fundamental changes to her optical structure. Most remarkably, she had begun to communicate with Harris through variations in her own luminescence, creating a silent dialogue conducted entirely through modulations of bioluminescent patterns. Henrik Larsson's transformation manifested through his relationship with the surrounding environment. The groundskeeper had developed an intuitive understanding of the hybrid creatures that had gathered around the facility, moving among them with an ease that suggested he had become part of their collective consciousness. His wooden sculptures had evolved into complex installations that seemed to channel and focus Harris's influence, creating focal points for the strange energies that permeated the area. The facility itself had become something beyond a medical institution. The building's structure had adapted to accommodate Harris's presence, with walls that seemed to breathe and floors that resonated with harmonic frequencies. The isolation ward where Harris resided had expanded beyond its original dimensions, though the three observers could not recall witnessing any physical construction. The space now resembled a cathedral more than a hospital room, with soaring ceilings that disappeared into shadows that seemed deeper than the building's actual height should have allowed. The external environment had transformed into a landscape that bore little resemblance to the Minnesota wilderness that had originally surrounded the facility. The melted zones had merged into a vast lake of perfectly still water that reflected not the sky above, but star patterns that belonged to no earthly constellation. The hybrid creatures had organized themselves into complex formations that served purposes beyond human understanding, their movements creating geometric patterns that complemented Harris's luminescent displays. Local authorities had attempted to investigate the reports of unusual phenomena emanating from the Pine Ridge area, but their efforts had been consistently frustrated by navigation difficulties that prevented them from locating the facility. Compass readings became unreliable within a certain radius of Harris's location, and maps of the area seemed to shift and change when consulted, as if the very geography was protecting the transformation taking place within its boundaries. The most significant development during this period was the emergence of what Dr. Aldrich termed the calling, a compulsive awareness that Harris's purpose was nearing completion. The three observers understood without communication that their role as witnesses was evolving into something more active, though the nature of their ultimate participation remained shrouded in mystery that felt both terrifying and inevitable. The seventh week marked the beginning of what Dr. Aldrich would describe in his final coherent journal entries as the convergence, a period during which the boundaries between observer and observed, between the facility and the surrounding reality, began to dissolve entirely. The physician's documentation from this period showed increasing difficulty in maintaining linear narrative, as if the very concept of sequential time had become meaningless in Harris's presence. The transformation of the three watchers had accelerated beyond recognition. Dr. Aldrich found that his thoughts had become synchronized with cosmic rhythms that operated on scales both infinitesimal and vast. His consciousness could perceive the movement of subatomic particles within Harris's form, while simultaneously grasping the orbital mechanics of distant galaxies. This expanded awareness came at the cost of his connection to mundane human concerns. The need for food, the sensation of cold, the passage of ordinary time had all become irrelevant abstractions. Nurse Finley's metamorphosis had progressed to the point where distinguishing her from Harris himself required careful observation. Her luminescence had intensified until she served as a secondary source of the strange light that bathed the facility, and her movements had acquired the same deliberate, purposeful quality that characterized Harris's subtle adjustments. Most remarkably, she had begun to exhibit the same absence of vital signs that defined Harris's condition, yet remained fully conscious and aware. Henrik Larsson had become something approaching a conduit between Harris and the transformed environment surrounding the facility. The groundskeeper moved through the hybrid ecosystem that had emerged around the building with the fluid grace of a creature perfectly adapted to its surroundings. His wooden sculptures had evolved into living constructs that pulsed with their own internal light and seemed to grow and change according to patterns that reflected Harris's influence on the local reality. The facility itself had undergone structural changes that defied architectural logic. Rooms had appeared that had never been built, corridors extended in directions that should have led outside the building's footprint, and the isolation ward had become a vast chamber whose dimensions seemed to shift depending on the observer's perspective. The building had become less a structure than a manifestation of Harris's consciousness made tangible, a physical expression of thoughts and intentions that operated beyond human comprehension. The external environment had transformed into something that bore no resemblance to the Minnesota wilderness. The lake of still water had expanded to encompass the horizon in all directions, its surface reflecting star patterns that changed in real time to mirror celestial configurations from across the universe. The hybrid creatures had organized themselves into vast, spiraling formations that rotated around the facility with the precision of planetary orbits, their movements creating harmonic frequencies that resonated through the transformed landscape. During this period, the three observers began to receive what Dr. Aldrich termed the transmission, a constant flow of information that seemed to originate from Harris but encompassed knowledge that extended far beyond any single consciousness. This data stream included scientific principles that had not yet been discovered by human civilization, historical events from civilizations that had never existed on Earth, and philosophical concepts that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality itself. The transmission revealed that Harris's manifestation in Pine Ridge was part of a vast network of similar events occurring across multiple dimensions of reality. Each instance of contact served as a node in a cosmic communication system that operated on timescales measured in geological epochs. The three observers had become integral components of this network, their transformed consciousness serving as relay points for information that would eventually propagate across the entire system. Most disturbing was the revelation that the convergence was not unique to their location. The transmission included glimpses of other facilities, other observers, other versions of Harris manifesting simultaneously across countless realities. Each group of watchers was undergoing the same transformation, becoming part of the same vast intelligence that existed beyond the boundaries of individual consciousness or physical form. The purpose of this cosmic network remained partially obscured, but the fragments of understanding that penetrated the observers, transformed awareness, suggested preparation for an event of unprecedented magnitude. Something was approaching, not through physical space, but through the dimensional barriers that separated different layers of reality, and the network of observers was being established to facilitate this arrival. By the conclusion of the 7th week, Dr. Aldrich had ceased his attempts to maintain conventional documentation. His final journal entry consisted of geometric patterns and symbols that resembled no known language, yet conveyed meaning to those who had undergone similar transformation. The age of observation had ended. The time of participation had begun. The 8th and final week of documented events at the Pine Ridge Medical Facility marked not an ending, but a transformation so complete that conventional narrative could no longer contain its scope. The records from this period exist not as written words, but as impressions left in the very fabric of reality itself, traces that would be discovered decades later by investigators who could never fully comprehend their significance. Edward Harris had ceased to exist as a discrete entity, his consciousness having expanded to encompass the entire transformed environment. The facility, the lake, the hybrid creatures, and the three observers had become components of a single vast intelligence that operated according to principles that transcended human understanding. What had begun as a medical case had evolved into something approaching a new form of existence entirely. The convergence reached its culmination during the winter solstice, when the cosmic alignments that had been building throughout Harris's presence achieved perfect synchronization. The facility became a focal point for energies that originated from sources scattered across the universe, creating a nexus where multiple dimensions of reality intersected. The three observers, no longer recognizable as individual human beings, served as conduits for forces that reshaped the fundamental nature of space and time in their immediate vicinity. Dr. Aldrich's consciousness, expanded beyond the limitations of his physical form, perceived the true scope of the network he had become part of. Across countless realities, similar convergences were occurring simultaneously, each one adding its unique resonance to a cosmic symphony that had been building for eons. The purpose of this vast undertaking finally became clear. It was preparation for the arrival of something that existed beyond the boundaries of any single universe. The entity that manifested during the final convergence defied description in terms that human language could accommodate. It was simultaneously ancient and newly born, vast beyond comprehension, yet intimate in its awareness of each individual consciousness that comprised the network. Its arrival did not occur through physical movement, but through a gradual alignment of dimensional barriers that allowed it to exist simultaneously across multiple layers of reality. Nurse Finley's transformed consciousness served as a bridge between the arriving entity and the human elements of the network. Her role had evolved from observer to translator, converting the entity's cosmic intentions into forms that could be integrated with terrestrial reality. The process was not violent or destructive, but rather resembled a careful calibration, ensuring that the entity's presence would enhance rather than overwhelm the existing order. Henrik Larsson's connection to the transformed environment became crucial during the final phase of the convergence. His consciousness had merged so completely with the hybrid ecosystem that he served as the entity's primary interface with the physical world. Through his awareness, the entity could perceive and interact with matter and energy in ways that allowed for gradual integration rather than catastrophic disruption. The facility itself became a permanent gateway, a stable point where the entity could maintain its presence without causing reality to collapse under the weight of its existence. The building's transformed architecture served as a complex mechanism for regulating the flow of cosmic energies, ensuring that the entity's influence would spread gradually across the planet rather than overwhelming it instantly. The hybrid creatures that had gathered around the facility revealed their true purpose during the final convergence. They were not random mutations, but carefully designed ambassadors, created to serve as intermediaries between the entity and Earth's existing life forms. Their role was to facilitate the gradual adaptation of terrestrial consciousness to the entity's presence, ensuring that the transformation would be evolutionary rather than destructive. The lake of still water that surrounded the facility became a communication medium, its surface serving as a vast display screen where the entity could project images and concepts directly into the consciousness of any observer. These transmissions contained instructions for humanity's gradual integration into the cosmic network, guidelines that would be discovered and interpreted by future generations. The final transformation occurred not with dramatic fanfare, but with a subtle shift that permeated every aspect of reality in the immediate vicinity. The three observers ceased to exist as separate entities, their consciousness absorbed into the greater intelligence that now resided permanently at the Pine Ridge location. Their individual knowledge and experiences became part of the entity's vast database, contributing human perspective to its cosmic awareness. In the years that followed, the Pine Ridge area would be avoided by local residents who reported strange dreams and inexplicable compulsions when they ventured too close. Official investigations would find no trace of the medical facility or its occupants, yet sensitive individuals would continue to detect the presence of something vast and patient, waiting for the proper time to extend its influence beyond the boundaries of its carefully maintained sanctuary. The case of Edward Harris had concluded, but the story it represented was only beginning. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Sinister Memory. If you enjoyed today's investigation, subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell to be alerted when we unveil our next dark chronicle. Share your thoughts about this case in the comments below. We read every single one, and your ideas often lead us to our next investigation. Until next time.